So again, the M stands for militarism, which is the buildup of weapons or armies. And the A stands for alliances, or secret agreements that help escalate the war super fast. These alliances create a bunch of connections between different countries and who they should be siding with. I'm sorry, guys, I'm in the nest, so it's really noisy. So A is for alliances. I is for imperialism. We've been discussing this. Imperialism is the competition for land or resources and national influence. So again, I stands for imperialism, competition for land or resources, and national and international influence. And finally, we have N, which stands for nationalism. Nationalism is the desire to unite ethnic groups and pride in one's country. So it's basically, if you live in Germany, you are proud to be a German, and you are going to try to advance the status of Germans if you are a nationalist. These are the four main overarching causes of the start of World War I. But as we know, it's the assassination of political leader Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary that triggers the war, and it begins to get started. Okay. We're now going to transition into what was the United States doing during this time? There was a significant debate about whether or not the United States should go into the war. And there are two main groups in the United States. These two groups are the preparedness movement and the peace movement. So again, the preparedness movement and the peace movement. The preparedness movement were Eastern Republicans who wanted the United States to be prepared for war, mostly because they could profit from it if they joined. So again, they joined the war because they wanted to join the war because of the business profit of potentially joining. On the other side, you have the peace movement. The peace movement was a group of Americans that adamantly did not want to enter World War I. So again, the peace movement are the groups of Americans that adamantly do not want to join World War I. And they are attached to this idea of American being isolationist. As we remember from George Washington, the United States was desperate to stay isolated from foreign affairs. And they were also anti-war. So they did not want to join the war. It's the peace movement. It's pretty straightforward. But as we know, the United States cannot stay isolated for forever. And so we look at how the neutrality was, how neutrality is threatened. So Woodrow Wilson was reelected in 1914 under the premise that he would keep the United States out of World War I. That was his job. That was what he was going to do. However, President Wilson soon found it really difficult to be able to hold on to that promise. And there are a series of events that lead to to the United States joining World War I. The first is the sinking of the Lusitania. You can see the Lusitania spelt on the slide. It is, I'll say it out loud, Lusitania. The Lusitania was a British ship that had Americans on board. So again, the Lusitania was a British ship that had 128 Americans on board and was sunk by German submarines. Americans argued that they should be held responsible again, I apologize for the external noise. And they argued that Germany should take accountability for the sinking of the Lusitania, and they do not do that. Here, guys, give me 1 second. Okay, let's see if that helps with the noise. There are other things that lead to Americans' neutrality being threatened. The next most notable thing is the Zimmermann telegram. In the Zimmermann telegram, Germany proposed an alliance with Mexico against the United States. And as we know, Mexico is the United States neighboring country to the south. And in the Zimmermann telegram, Germany promised Mexico that they would get their Mexican-American land, the land that they lost during the Mexican-American War. So the Mexican cession territory, they promised that they would have it. So again, they would get that Mexican cession territory back. And finally, the last major cause that threatened the American neutrality is the Russian Revolution. As we know, America has a history of not liking communism. And so when the communists take over Russia, the United States was encouraged to align against Russia. Thank you, Kayla. So with the Zimmermann telegram, Germany promised Mexico that they would get the Mexican cession territory back. So again, Zimmermann telegram, Germany promised Mexico that if they helped them during the war, they would get the Mexican cession territory back from the United States. And the Russian Revolution encouraged Woodrow Wilson to side with the Allied powers. It's only 11 slides and we are on slide 5. We got it. Okay. Now we're going to look at the military side of World War I very quickly. The United States quickly mobilized for war to fight on the side of those that they had economic alliances with, Britain and France. This benefited the United States economically, as well as increasing trust between these three countries. At first, the United States put in very few soldiers into the war effort, but eventually they would become one of the primary fighting forces as Europe had suffered so much during World War I. With the United States military at full strength, the Allies were able to push back Germany and force the end of the war in November of 1918. So again, the end of the war comes from American help at the end of November in 1918. So again, the main thing you need to know from the slide is that yes, this was the end of the war, November of 1918. That's what you guys gotta know. Okay, now we're gonna look and see what kind of role does the United States have during this war effort. So how is the United States mobilized? And there are 4 pieces to this federal government intervention. So as you guys see, the name of the slide is mobilization, and then your next term is federal government intervention. There are 4 pieces to federal government intervention during World War I. So the 4 pieces that go into the United States federal government intervention is first the War Industries Board. Again, the War Industries Board. And this was in charge of industrial and agricultural production during the war. So again, the War Industries Board was in charge of industrial and agricultural production during the war. Next, you have the Food Administration, which was created to preserve food to supply Allied troops. So again, the Food Administration was created to preserve food and provide it to Allied troops. Next is the Railroad Administration. So again, we have the War Industries Board first, who was in control of industrial and agricultural production. Second, the Food Administration, which preserved food to supply to the Allies in Europe. If you guys are watching my script, make sure you listen to what I say to you, because I'm skipping around a little bit to work with time. So again, the Food Administration was in charge of preserving food to provide it to the Allied war effort. Third, the Railroad Administration took control of the railroads to help standardize equipment. So the railroad was used to help provide things and send them throughout the country and prepare them for shipment to the Allies. And finally, we have the National War Labor Board, which helped businesses and laborers settle disputes. So as we've discussed earlier, this is a high time of unionizing. So the National War Labor Board is in charge of communicating between businesses and those unions. Despite all of this effort for intervening with the war effort, they still were unable to draft enough men to join the war. So they have to implement a military draft. The military draft is also known as the Selective Service Act of 1917. So again, the military draft is also known as the Selective Service Act, which was passed in 1917. And the Selective Service Act of 1917 requires that all men aged 18 to 45 register for the draft. So again, it's called the Selective Service Act. The military draft is also known as the Selective Service Act, which was passed in 1917. Just as a reminder, this is getting recorded and I will be posting it within the next 2 hours. So if there's any small things that you miss, you can also come back to the video. I'm sure it's going to be very interesting to watch played back. And I just saw, Kayla, your message. The last one is the National War Labor Board, which helps settle disputes between businesses and unions. Okay. Next, we're going to skip on to probably the most controversial piece of American history from World War I in terms of domestic interference, which is this idea of enforcing liberty, specifically through the Espionage Act and Schenck versus the US. Schenck versus the United States is a court case that you are also going to need to know for AP government. So just kind of setting up that caliber of how important Schenck versus the United States is in terms of a court case. As a reminder, as we know, this is the first time that the United States is ever involved in a really divisive war effort that's not within the United States. This is the first time that the United States is fighting a foreign war, which creates a lot of discontent in the United States about whether or not they should even be there. And so the United States decides to pass some laws limiting people's free speech. The first that is really notable is the Espionage Act. The Espionage Act was passed in 1917. So again, Espionage Act passed in 1917, and it put people in prison who tried to incite a rebellion in the military or obstruct the draft. So again, the Espionage Act imprisoned people who tried to incite a rebellion in the military or tried to obstruct the draft. And some of these things could be very, very minor that they would be put in jail for. The next act that you should know is the Sedition Act. I'm going to write that in the chat. The Sedition Act. The Sedition Act was passed in 1918 and went even further. And it prohibited anybody from making disloyal remarks about the United States government. So again, it would be made illegal. It would be made illegal if people wrote negatively about the United States. That is the Sedition Act. Okay, so that is the Sedition Act. And there are some very prominent people that are against the Sedition Act. Exactly, Mela. Like anything that we ever talk about negatively in terms of the United States, we would go to jail for because of the Sedition Act. And the most notable court case that comes out of this is, again, Schenck versus the United States. So make sure you have Schenck versus the United States. In Schenck versus the United States, the court upheld the Espionage Act. And so what I mean by the court upheld the Espionage Act, the Supreme Court argued that the Espionage Act was constitutional. And in the 1919 decision, so again, Schenck versus the United States was done in 1919. This is the part I want to make sure you write down. It determines the clear and present danger clause. Again, the clear and present danger clause. And what the clear and present danger clause means is if the speech that somebody does is a clear and present danger to the public, then it can be limited. What is that clear or present danger? Who knows? The government will decide. But they will use that justification of clear and present danger. And just to preview, we are going to be doing a deeper dive into Schenck versus the United States next week. So just make sure you have a star next to this slide so you have these notes available. Because of time, I'm now going to skip down to the end of the war. As we know, World War I does a lot of change in the United States, but I want to look specifically at how this changes the way that the United States interacts with the world. And the reason why I want to do this is, again, next week, you also have a lesson on the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles. So that's why I'm skipping down to this slide. So that way we have all of the context we need. So as the end of the war began, as the end of the war was in sight, the different countries involved had to decide what peace looked like. What decisions are they going to make to keep the United States involved as a political power? Do they go back to being isolationists? Like, what do they do? And President Wilson had a plan known as the 14 points. So again, the 14 points is President Wilson's plan. The main goals of the 14 points was to promote free trade, end alliances, reduce arms, and establish a national peace, an international peace organization. I'll repeat those for you. So again, the main goals of the 14 points are to promote free trade, end alliances, reduce arms, and establish an international peace organization. This international peace organization is also called the League of Nations. So again, that international peace organization, that fourth point or the fourth goal is known as the League of Nations. And the goal of the League of Nations was to bring the different nations of the world together to debate through speech and debate through talking, rather than jump to a military involvement. So again, the goal is to keep the United States out of war and different countries out of war. However, the 14 points, especially the League of Nations, was vastly unpopular in the United States. So again, the 14 points in the Treaty of, in the League of Nations was vastly unpopular in the United States, especially from Republicans. Republicans in the United States believed that the United States had no business being involved in foreign affairs after the war was over. And most of their opposition was centered on this idea of the League of Nations. Republicans like Senator Lodge, he's one of the most notable ones, believed that the League of Nations would force the United States business into the hands of other countries. So again, they feared that if the United States was involved in the League of Nations, then other countries around the world would tell them what to do. And so because of its mass unpopularity from this time, ultimately, the United States is not a part of the Treaty of Versailles, and ultimately Congress rejects it. And the United States never joins the League of Nations. So again, the United States does not sign anything. They do not agree with anything. And so what is the legacy of this? As we know from Mr. Quinn's class, the failures of World War I and the United States' role in World War I directly lead to World War II. The League of Nations only lasts for 26 years. Again, the League of Nations only lasted for 26 years, and all of the punishments inflicted on Germany after the Treaty of Versailles lead to that fuel that will lead to World War II. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you guys so much for your patience in today's lecture with external noise and everything. I'll go ahead and open up the chat or raising hands if you guys have any questions, if there's anything that I need to repeat. Yes, 26 years. The League of Nations only lasted for 26 years. So again, if you missed anything from the lecture or need me to repeat anything, yes, Kamaya, ultimately the legacy of the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles it's bad. Just to sum up, the League of Nations only lasts for 26 years. And as we know, all of the new decisions that were made within the Treaty of Versailles ultimately lead to World War II. Any other questions or things that we missed? Cool. Okay, so that is it for the lecture. I know I skipped a little bit. Everything that is important you guys got. So I'm gonna go ahead and send you guys to the, wait, there's one more thing I wanna get to, sorry. So one other key term that is unrelated to the last slide that you guys need to know is the Great Migration, which should sound familiar to most of you. So again, write this one last key term. It's not related to any of the slides we went over. The Great Migration refers to the mass exodus of African Americans from the South into urban cities. So again, because of increased violence, lack of opportunity in the South, the Great Migration is what we call this mass movement of African Americans in the South to the West and to urban cities. So I just want to make sure we have that key term. Okay. That is it in terms of the key content for today's lecture. You guys can go ahead and head to the exit ticket. And once I check your exit ticket and see that you submitted your pictures of your lecture notes, you'll be free to go. Thank you so much for your patience. And in this weird lesson, this video will also be posted in the next couple of hours, so you can check your notes if there's anything that you think you missed. Feel free to email me or text me if you have any questions. Once I see that you've submitted both your classwork, the lecture notes, you press the turn in button with the pictures of your lecture notes and the exit ticket, you will be free to go. Just give me